Hi, my name's Neil Ferris. Some of you may have visited the Museum of Ontario Archaeology's Arts and Culture page hosted by Google that's online. And if you went there, you would have seen a range of artifacts illustrated from just a few of the collections held at the museum's repository here in London. Those extensive collections represent the deep and rich heritage, history, and archaeology of the province of Ontario. And what I want to do today is focus on just a few of those artifacts and share with you a story about the archaeological site they come from, and more importantly, some of the people who helped shape that archaeology. Okay, well, when you go to the museum's Arts and Culture page, you are first greeted by this page. And on this page, if you scroll down below, you'll come across a range of images of artifacts, and you can click on individual images to learn more about those artifacts. But above those images is a banner of artifacts that are grouped by geography. And I'm going to focus today on the items that come from Amherstburg. So if you click on that image, you are then taken to a page that shows all the artifacts, and these artifacts all come from the same archaeological site. That archaeological site is, of course, located in southwestern Ontario along the Detroit River. It's called the Matthew Elliott site, and it's located just south of Amherstburg and across from the southern tip of Bois Blanc Island, or as is known locally down there, the Boblo Island. Matthew Elliott is a very interesting character and important figure in the early colonial history of Ontario. He was born in Ireland and came to North America in the 18th century. He first came to the United States, or what was to be the United States, where he was a trader working in the Ohio frontier, trading for furs and other goods with a range of indigenous nations. He became very close, in particular, with the Shawnee. During that time, he was a British loyalist. So when the American Revolution broke out, he fought on the side of the British and fought against the Americans for the British. After the war, he did move to the area south of Amherstburg that the Matthew Elliott site is located on. He acquired a couple hundred acres of land and established, in effect, a plantation on that land. Now, this area of southwestern Ontario, the Detroit River, is a very, very rich part of the early history, certainly anyways, of Ontario, and a very rich archaeological heritage for this part of the world. During the time that Elliott lived on the property, he was a British agent, Indian agent, in what was referred to at the time as the British Indian Department. And these folks were responsible for maintaining good relations with their Indigenous allies. And part of that included negotiating and providing gifts from the British Crown to Indigenous allies on an annual or even semi-annual basis. As a result, across on Boblo Island was an extensive settlement of Indigenous people, a wide range of nations from the Western, Old Northwest as it was referred to, the area of Michigan, Ontario, Ohio, and Indiana. And these people would gather to receive these goods from the British Crown, to negotiate and plan stratagems for dealing with the expansion of the Americans in this region at that time. Also in Amherstburg was the Fort Malden, It was established in 1795. It was established by the British military after they surrendered Detroit at the conclusion of the American Revolution. Also worth noting is that on Buffalo Island, through the 18th century, were a number of Wendat villages. These communities established there and then would move to other locations in southwestern Ontario and Michigan, and the Wendat remain a very vibrant part of the community of the Detroit River region on both sides of the border to this day. So this was a very rich and very active area of the province during this late 18th century, early 19th century, especially that time between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Now, Elliott's estate, depicted here on a map from 1810, included a two-story frame and stone house. That was his own residence, but there were several outbuildings on the property as well, too. Some of those outbuildings including a storehouse for the Indian Department to store goods and supplies for these distributions. But there was also workhouses and labor huts on his property for the folks who worked his plantation. And Elliott rather notoriously is known as a slave owner, and there were dozens of enslaved people who worked on his plantation in the 1790s and first decade of the 19th century. Elliott's history ends on this property at the start of the War of 1812. He actually retired by that point, but became active again and led a number of battles against the Americans in the War of 1812, and eventually died in 1814 before the conclusion of the War of 1812. Afterwards, his property passed through a number of owners, including his widow and son and descendants. And in the 19th century, his manor house stood and remained standing into the 20th century, and was actually a historical landmark in the area as the Elliott Homestead. Ironically, for this person who was a slave owner, subsequently in the 19th century, other individuals own this property who are active in helping enslaved individuals flee the United States into Canada. And George and Eliza Harris are two of those individuals who briefly stayed here, very briefly stayed here on their journey into Canada from the United States. Eliza Harris becomes an important individual in Harriet Beecher Stowe's research for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in fact is represented by the character Eliza in that novel. And she stayed at this house as she fled the United States. And locally, this place became known as Eliza's cottage or cabin in local history well into the 20th century. So the Elliott House itself, as you can see here, although by this time in the early 20th century had been subject to modifications, included two chimneys and a two-story frame and stone structure, various outbuildings, a milk house, and other structures there. And really the remains of these houses stood until around the end of World War II, the 1940s, where they had collapsed by, I gather, by the 1950s. And the archaeology still remained intact there and was subject to archaeological field schools by a range of individuals between 1969 and 1982. And then again in 2004, I was involved in some salvage archaeology because unfortunately, through a loophole in the newly passed Ontario Heritage Act of the time, a single house was allowed to be built on the site of the Matthew Elliott homestead. In fact, you can see in this photograph from 2004, the Matthew Elliott plaque, which is looking rather forlorn against the backdirt piles of the house construction. It did impact archaeological deposits from the 18th century that we were able to very quickly document on that very cold day in November. However, the archaeology does remain intact, and the field schools which were conducted in the 60s through the 1980s were documented, and the collections were documented in the 1980s as well. And the excavations focused around the foundations of the two-chimney homestead, which is thought to be Matthew Elliott's home. So these artifacts that are in the museum's arts and culture page all come from those excavations in those field schools. And those artifacts all date to the time that Matthew Elliott was there and are a reflection of the engagement between the British Crown and Indigenous allies at the time. So, for example, we have a pipe bowl made of red catlinite stone, which was a very familiar pipe form found in the 18th century and smoked by Indigenous people, and likely is associated with some kind of meeting between Elliott and other Crown officials and their Indigenous allies. I should mention people like Joseph Brandt and Tecumseh all visited Elliott at his homestead and met each other there to discuss their plans in the late 18th, early 19th century. Above the pipe bowl is a dragon side plate, which appears in a musket and is used to anchor the flintlock to a musket. And then next to that, that side plate are a range of lead artifacts. You can see 4 round lead seals. These are seals that would have been attached to bales or bundles of linen or cloth. And so the fact that we're finding several of them in the collections from Matthew Elliott's site again reflects the fact that these are likely trade-related materials, because cloth and linen were certainly regular items appearing on the gift lists in the distribution of goods to Indigenous allies. Next to those 4 in the middle, that very large lead seal is something that is quite intriguing, very rare, and hasn't been found. You can see that it comes from one of the units, I believe Unit 7 of the excavation units next to the Elliott Foundation, Homestead Foundation. And I put this map on here just to underscore how rich the range of artifacts are from this little area of the archaeological site that relate to that exchange and trade of goods by the British Crown. So the lead object, the lead seal in particular, is of interest to me because you can perhaps make out on a closer illustration of the image a crest, the arms of the British Crown. And this is important both for underscoring that, yeah, this is associated with the British government, but critically, it also helps date the deposit, because there was some debate at the time of the field school whether this really was Matthew Elliott's homestead or something else. But I think these artifacts and the research that was done in analyzing the collections remove any shadow of a doubt of that. In particular, the coat of arms that appears on this seal is the coat of arms of the British government. And here's an illustration of that, that coat of arms. Actually, that illustration is the coat of arms of King George III, whose reign overlapped with the Matthew Elliott period of this archaeological site. But you can see that the coat of arms are quite similar. Importantly, you'll notice on both the seal and the illustration of the coat of arms, the central crest, the upper right quadrant of that crest shows 3 fleurs-de-lis, which is a reference to the time when Britain's empire extended into parts of France. Well, that hadn't existed for several centuries, and in an act in 1800, enacted in January 1st, 1801, the British Crown, British coat of arms changed, and the definition of the British Empire changed, removing those fleurs-de-lis, which means, of course, that the crest that we're seeing on the lead seal has to predate 1801. And given that Elliott only moved on to that location in 1784, this seal clearly dates to the period of time between 1704 and 1801. Now, Elliott was a kind of notorious character, and it's very hard to find either primary sources or secondary sources that are offer an unbiased opinion about him one way or the other. That's not surprising. He was quite notorious in his participation in raids and battles with the Americans. So American accounts of Elliott are quite negative at the time. But he also managed to annoy a lot of British Crown officials. There are lots of suggestions, and you can read more about Matthew Elliott in Reginald Horseman's very good biography of him, published in the 1980s, I believe, but still available. Elliott was known to feather his own nest in his engagement with the British Crown. And when Fort Malden was established in 1795, a real tension emerged between the Indian Department, which was situated on Elliott's homestead and plantation, and the British military in the fort, who expected very close accounting of the monies and supplies and materials, and expected Elliott to report through them what he was doing in his negotiation with Indigenous allies. And one commander of the fort, Commander McLean, accused Elliott of bribery and of inflating population estimates of Indigenous allies to gain more goods for distribution, which he then retained. And in fact, this went on for a number of years, and Elliott's commission was dismissed in 1797, and he fought very hard for a number of years to be reinstated, and very much objected to the way he was treated by the British Crown. But it's interesting to note that in some of the testimony against him brought by Maclean is a quote from an individual from James Byrne, who used to work for Elliott, who noted in 1799 that he saw, and I'm quoting here, he saw in Captain Elliott's bedroom a bale of Indian goods, which appeared to be cloth, which bale was marked with the broad arrow. And the broad arrow is another symbol of property of the British government. And certainly the lead seal that's illustrated on the museum's Arts and Culture page is a seal of material of goods that were of the British government. In fact, sometimes the coat of arms seal is referred to as the broad arrow itself. So it's fascinating to think that this very artifact, this very seal, could be the seal attached to that bale lying on Elliott's bed in 1799 that was part of his undoing and in his loss of commission from the British government at the time. So that's it for me in terms of my talk. I find this archaeology very fascinating, and the stories in the collection from the Matthew Elliott site speaks volumes to life on the late 18th, early 19th century, but it also speaks to the changing history of Amherstburg and the Detroit River through the 19th century itself, and archaeological work that has been done in that area have documented many Indigenous sites that date back several thousand years. And this is just one corner of the province of Ontario. And there are many, many other stories to be told from these shelves in the museum's repository. And I hope you've enjoyed this one. And I hope this encourages you to go to the page, the Arts and Culture page, and explore some of the other artifacts there. Hopefully we can tell you more about some of the other archaeological sites and people who shaped that archaeology in future episodes. Till then, all the best and stay safe.